The direwolf is the first species that we're bringing back at Colossal.
That thing's not a direwolf. I think they can't do it. I think they shouldn't do it. I think what they said they've done, they haven't done. This is the one thing I can argue with actually some confidence. A lot of my training is in taxonomy, so the identification and recognition of species and other lineages and what constitutes a species. I teach courses on it. I did a master's in it, and I've named a couple of dozen species. And their arguments for how they're defining their species is not one that any taxonomist would give the slightest time of day to. It's weirdly convoluted. So you say it's the same thing as a direwolf because it's got the ears, which we can't see, and it's got the same behavior, which we don't know what it is. Eh?
Dr. David Hone is a paleontologist, evolutionary biologist, and one of the world's foremost experts on dinosaur behaviour, busting myths about how they hunted, how smart they were.
Clever girl.
And what these ancient creatures can still teach us about evolution and animal life today. He's the author of some of the most celebrated dinosaur books ever written, including How Fast Did T-Rex Run, and is a go-to media expert featured in multitude of documentaries and major news outlets. In this episode, we explore the minds of dinosaurs, analyze viral paleontology clips, and deep dive into the science and ethics of de-extinction, including Colossal Biosciences' wild mission to bring back the direwolf, the mammoth, and other extinct animals. A project David has some very strong opinions on. Subscribe if you want to know why bringing back extinct creatures might be the most dangerous idea of the 21st century.
The idea that you can make mammoths, it's never going to happen. It just won't. And even if you can, how are you going to get it born? The only thing that can gestate that is an elephant, an endangered species. You should not be messing around with endangered species to produce an extinct species for an ecosystem that doesn't exist.
Right.
Just don't do it.
What were your motivations in writing a book about dinosaur behavior? I got one question every time I mentioned to someone that I was talking to someone about dinosaur behavior, and I can guess that you can guess that question. It's how the hell do we know anything about dinosaur behavior?
Yeah, well, I mean, you've asked me two questions, which is why did I write the book, and then how the hell do we know anything?
Yes.
So, first one was partly because I got offered to do it. It was something I had wanted to do, but then the opportunity came up. Whereas with my other books, I've had to shop ideas around publishers and hassle them a bit, which is more effort than someone coming to you with a check going, how would you like to have this money in exchange for doing something you already want to do? which certainly makes life easier. How do we know anything? Well, I wrote a book about it, actually. But there's a whole bunch of different ways with varying levels of confidence to try and put together, what we know. And some of it is really quite, like painfully obvious once you start to explain it. People go, oh, well, that's obvious. It's like, yeah, but you've asked the question, how do you know? Things with sharp teeth usually eat meat. Things with blunt teeth usually eat plants. But that immediately tells you a huge amount about the behavior of an animal. If you then add that into size, because small carnivores are still vulnerable to large carnivores, but large carnivores basically aren't vulnerable to anything, whereas small and large herbivores are vulnerable to small and large carnivores. And that affects your behavior. You will need to do some form of vigilance, or you'll need to be nocturnal, or you'll need to live in a group to increase your defense, or you need to develop some kind of armor or spikes or something like this. Well, okay. Some of those things we can look at. We have mass mortality sites where we have multiple members of a species preserved together, implying they live in groups. If they've got straight up armor on them, we can see it. If they have particularly large eyes, that gives you a sense of their vision, obviously, but we can scan into skulls of fossil animals and get an idea of their ear canals, which gives you an idea of their range of hearing, both how good it is and what pitches they are attuned to. We can scan in and get the structure of the brain, which will tell you how much of their brain they have devoted to sight, smell, or sound. So that then tells you something more about their senses. We can look at damage and injuries to bones. That gives you an idea of what things are attacking them or what things are feeding on them. We have stomach contents, both for carnivores and herbivores, so you can find out what sort of things they're eating. We can do mechanical studies, like we can try and work out how strong was this bone, how big was the muscle on that bone, so how strong could that pull? So could it move fast, or could it move slowly but powerfully, or at what point would this bone break, or what point would this tooth break? How strong is the armor in that animal? Is it stronger or weaker than the tooth of the animal we think might be biting it? And so you can start to stack lines of evidence on lines of evidence, and therefore start moving towards solutions. And it's always that, it's moving towards solutions. The analogy I give, which I think is an inexact one, but it works well in my head, of like, you've got like a giant sphere of the range of possible behaviors and actions of any given animal. And in the middle of it is a relatively small ball, which is what they actually usually did.
Right.
And the question is, how much of that outer casing can we lop off on which sides to kind of get down to the center? And some simple things like it probably lived in a group, or it probably ate meat. You lop off an enormous chunk and get right down to the center very quickly. With a lot of the others, it's way, way harder. But you're still at least taking that giant sphere and knocking some very irregular lumps off it in places, and some much better than others. But actually, we often have, I think, a bit of a sense of how good or how bad we are at that. As in, we kind of known unknowns. We know we don't know this, or we know that this is very hard to predict. And so that area we know we haven't attacked very well. Whereas this area, like the biomechanics, could it accelerate well? What did it have a decent top speed? Could it turn well? Okay, this was a very fast and agile animal that's going to have enormous implications for its behavior. We're probably getting right down to the core here. So yeah, we can do a hell of a lot, and usually an awful lot more than people think. But also, in my experience, we can work out a lot of things that people don't think we can work out, and we can't work out an awful lot of things that people think we can work out, which means that there's this real disjunct between, I think, what the public thinks we know and what we actually know in both directions.
2025 is the year that me and you are going to fix our sleep. Now, that does not mean that we need to go full Brian Johnson on it, but one thing we can do that's super easy is to buy the highest quality sleep mask on the market, and that is Manta. I've been blown away by how much better I sleep with one of these on. It's just a fact that people are not sleeping in completely dark environments, and studies show that that affects sleep quality, time to get to sleep, and increases the fragmentation of your sleep. I have tried other sleep masks. I first bought one on Amazon last year for like €5, but the problem is they're just really poor quality. They don't really block out any of the light, and you can't adjust them to your planet-sized head. Manta is fully adjustable, so it literally will fit all of the strangest and weirdest size heads out there, like mine. The Manta mask is literally completely blackout. I have studio lights coming at me from here, and I can't tell the difference. It is absolutely pitch black. This is the perfect environment that you need for sleep. Manta honestly feels like you're being cuddled by a cloud. I actively enjoy and look forward to putting these on each night. I just realized how boring that makes my life sound. I sleep with Manta every single night, and I've seen direct improvements in the quality, duration, and how rested I feel when I wake up. My Whoop data seems to agree. I also bought one for my girlfriend, and she also loves it. Manta have a bunch of different sleep masks on their website. I have tried the normal sleep mask as well as the sound mask. I like to listen to audiobooks at night, so for that reason, the sound mask was actually really, really good. For some reason, my girlfriend doesn't want to listen to how reality is a perception at 11 o'clock when we're trying to sleep, so this was a really good solution for that. It's also incredibly comfortable. But as I said, I think for most people, like 90% of people, the normal ordinary mask is going to fill their requirements. Super comfortable and completely adjustable. Literally is just a really high quality, well-made product. It's the best on the market. Manta are giving my viewers 10% off their first sleep mask. They ship internationally, and they also offer a 60-day free trial. That's 59 of the best nights of sleep you've ever had. I literally promise that. But if for any reason you aren't satisfied, you will get your money back, no questions asked. I really couldn't recommend more if you're looking to do something to improve your sleep. A sleep mask is the lowest hanging fruit. It's so simple and easy to apply, and I think it will benefit your life and overall health, and I could not recommend Manta more. Give an example of that. I find that really fascinating. Can you give an example of something that seems like we should be able to know that information based on whatever instinct we have on, dinosaurs from 60 million years ago, and then the vice versa? What is something that we do know?
So one thing I've written an awful lot about is group behavior. People think, oh yeah, we know that group hunted in packs. It's like, no, when you actually dig into the evidence, we found 3 or 4 of those animals together once. And if you think that's evidence that they even lived together, let alone hunted together, you are miles out. And I say this to fellow academics who've advocated that, and the general public. That's extremely weak evidence. There are animals that do all kinds of weird things, including large carnivores. Everyone kind of knows, in inverted commas, everyone knows lions live in groups. Well, they mostly do, but males can and often are solitary. So it's not like they all do it. Cheetahs, males live in groups, usually brothers, but occasionally unrelated coalitions, whilst females are solitary. So actually they have a sex split in their group behavior. To go, Velociraptor and kin, this is the classic one, the Dromaeosaurs, they're pack hunters. And it's like, no, we found a group together once. But maybe that was a group that hunted together, but it doesn't mean that's what they all did all the time.
Right.
Maybe the males don't do that like lions, or maybe the females don't do that like cheetahs. So it's really not amazing evidence. And actually, because we've only ever found one group like that, my guess is it's probably a chance association. And that's not normally what they did. Maybe that was the result of them trying to cross a river or tackling something that they shouldn't. There are what are called predator traps. The tar pits, which obviously aren't dinosaurs, but the famous La Brea tar pits and places like this, where basically a big herbivore gets stuck, so a carnivore comes along and tries to eat it and gets stuck, so a carnivore comes along and tries to eat that and gets stuck, and suddenly you have, these famous fossil beds with like 300 or 400 direwolves in them and one mammoth. And it's like, that was not a pack of 400 direwolves trying to bring down a mammoth. This is very extended scavenging going wrong. So things like that happen as well. So you do have to be very careful about interpreting the data that we actually have. And I think it's a confidence problem. I think in the past, we've often been very overconfident in what we think we know based on the data we have. And yes. I think we should be an awful lot less confident based on the information that we have.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm comparing it from a neuroscience or psychology perspective, even with humans, that we find it hard to replicate a psychological study and to get some sort of cohesive base of knowledge on human beings, which still exists today. And you can ask them questions and put electrodes on their brain and read things. But you've
got a big sample size. You've got billions of people. I've often got half an arm.
Yes. And exactly. With that in mind, like, how reliable do you really think what we have at the moment is? What's really solid and then what's less solid about dinosaur behavior?
So I think it comes down to having, where possible, and for some things we can do this, multiple independent lines of evidence that basically align.
Right.
So one I talk a lot about is Spinosaurs. You may well know Spinosaurus, which was made famous by Jurassic Park 3, and a horrible bastardized version of it appears to be coming back in the next film as a result of the, at least from what I've seen in the trailers. But Spinosaurus and the Spinosaurs as a whole, this is a group of dinosaurs known primarily from Europe, Africa, and South America. They have a whole bunch of things in common with each other. Unsurprisingly, they're fairly closely related. But all the things that we can kind of do with them point to one answer. So we tend to find them in environments with a lot of water. We also tend to find them in environments with actually not many other large carnivorous dinosaurs, or in isolated and weird places where we're not finding a lot else. Their general build, like in particular, the overall shape of the skull, and in particular the shape of the teeth, is very similar both to modern crocodiles, but also a whole bunch of extinct animals that we're very confident ate fish. Things that lived in the ocean. Well, those are probably eating fish. They actually look quite a lot like dolphins, and we know what dolphins eat. On top of that, if you look at the actual biomechanics, so again, how do the jaws close and how do they operate, and some subtleties of the shapes of the things like the teeth, position of the eyes, they are familiar to animals that have a very rapid bite and can move the head very, very rapidly. that links to eating something much smaller than you that's often quite quick. And actually, if we look at the isotopic data, if you look at so isotopes of elements that have preserved in the fossil record, there's actually a pretty clear signature between animals that drink a lot of water, and that includes things that live in water and eat a lot of aquatic food, so things like flamingos, and terrapins and fish and crocodiles and hippos, and things that don't. And if you compare Spinosaurs to a lot of the things living in their environment at the time, lo and behold, they look more like crocodiles and fish and terrapins than they do the other terrestrial dinosaurs. And then finally, as a killer, if you really needed it, Baryonyx, the British Spinosaur, was found with fish scales preserved in its chest cavity. So they're eating fish, and they're eating quite a lot of fish.
Right.
And all these different things point to one solution, which is eating a lot of fish. Now, that doesn't mean they just ate fish. Crocs eat plenty of larger animals when they can, and at least a couple of Spinosaurs, we actually have evidence of them eating other animals as well. But they're fundamentally hanging around in coastal environments, estuaries, lakes, deltas, places like this, and they're clearly eating a lot of fish, or at least a lot of aquatic prey. So again, maybe that's crabs and crayfish, maybe that's baby crocodiles, maybe that's large terrapins or sharks, or squid and stuff like this, but fundamentally they are mostly fish eaters. And that's the sort of thing you can be extremely confident about.
Right.
Again, the flip side of that of, well, what are a lot of the other big carnivores doing? Actually, we've got a pretty poor idea because we don't have very much data at all. Big carnivores are probably eating bigger things than small carnivores, but it's often very unclear quite what they're hunting or if they had any kind of preference. It's very hard to tell apart often things like hunting versus scavenging. So we know they're eating dead stuff, but did they kill it or did they find it? Or in what kind of proportions were those things found? That's really, really difficult. And again, point you were sort of making about people, we have quite a job doing this often with living species. Again, it's actually surprisingly hard to find out what even really obvious animals like wildebeest and zebra are eating. Because, of course, you see them stick their head down into this forest of grass and then come up and start chewing. It's like, but what exactly did they eat? Because it's easy to say grass, but there's a whole bunch of other different plant species nestled in and around that, and we don't actually know exactly what they just picked up. Are they getting a mouthful of grass as they target this other specific plant? Or are they just eating everything? Well, actually, it's very, very hard to work out, even when we can directly observe them. So, of course, when we're often running off this second or third-hand information or very partial information, it's half a skeleton. It's very hard to say. And worse than that, actually, you then get the problem of biases in the fossil record. So the great example I give of this is baby crocodiles. Baby crocodile, up to about a meter long or so, that will remove a finger very happily. It can remove an arm if you, or certainly a hand if you're very unlucky. But actually, about half their diet is invertebrates. They're eating dragonfly larvae. They're eating spiders. They're eating a lot of inverts, relatively soft stuff. They are eating frogs and fish and mice, and if they can catch a baby bird or get an egg, they'll eat that too. But about half their diet is like insects and related stuff. That's the sort of thing that's never going to preserve in the fossil record. If you get even a beautifully complete little crocodile skeleton, maybe you'll find the bones of a bird, or a frog or a rat in their stomach. What you won't find is bits of spider. So, of course, you'd look at that and go, wow, they've got bird bones and mammal bones and frog bones. They're a generalist predator of small vertebrates. That's less than half their diet, but it's 100% of the data we can observe.
Right. So how did we figure out that it was half their diet?
By it's a thing called stomach flushing. You basically catch an unfortunate crocodile, shove a hose down its throat, fill its stomach with water, and hold it upside down. It's a bit more technical than that, and it's nothing like as cruel as it sounds. But you can basically force them to regurgitate whatever they've eaten recently.
Gotcha.
And if you do that, I haven't done this. There's lots of studies on this. You can just pull out the whole bit before they've been digested, and lo and behold, it's a surprisingly large amount of these small invertebrates and surprisingly low amount of the sort of things you'd think that they would be catching and eating.
Right. Makes complete sense. I get a sense from your chain of logic that studying how animals live today in their current ecosystems is a very important part of deciphering the dinosaur jigsaw puzzle. I think a lot of
It,
people might have them kind of separately, right? Just because the sheer amount of time that has passed between modern animals and dinosaurs, they kind of hold them in separate camps. But sort of, what can we learn from the animals that live today, and how important is
I
that?
mean, an awful lot. I mean, first of all, things like mechanical comparisons, even the simple stuff like tooth shape and things like that, or brain structure, it's absolutely reliant on the data from living animals. But more than that, there are like macro patterns of behavior which really transcend things like size and evolutionary relationships or where you live. So one of them that I've written about is basically prey choice. What do predators eat? And the vast majority of predators, like the overwhelming majority, take stuff that is, I think it is something like, I'm trying to remember the numbers from a paper that I read a couple of years ago and now can't remember the details. But it's something like 70% take stuff that's less than 50% of their mass, and 80% take stuff that's less than 25% of their mass. In other words, animal predators eat stuff that is much, much smaller than them. And
Right.
of course, what we actually I think we have a very inverse position of that, because again, we see so many documentaries where it's lions jumping on wildebeest or even buffalo, and that's quite unusual already. And then of course, it's a group of lions which sort of cheats things. But yeah, like, cats hunt mice. They don't actually usually hunt rats. Rats are pretty big compared to a typical size domestic cat. They're actually too big. Owls hunt voles. Voles are really, really small. Bats and small birds hunt insects that are really quite tiny. You tend to hunt stuff that is much, much smaller than you. And more than that, you also tend to hunt stuff that is a juvenile, because juveniles have all kinds of penalties associated with their biology that adults don't have. They're naive. They don't know what predators are, or don't know how to respond to them, or don't know what smell or sight they're looking for to trigger the escape response until they've encountered them. They're bad at foraging. They're not good at finding good food. They don't know what they're finding or where to hunt. They stand in stupid places like next to cover where a predator might hide, and all the things like this. And so predators actively prefer juvenile prey because they're so much more vulnerable. And then, of course, when you're getting into things like dinosaurs, though it's also true of things like large mammals, well, babies don't have the horns and spikes and plates and armor and all the defenses that the adults have. And again, that's also true of antelope and deer, where they often have big horns and spikes and things that babies don't have. And this is true at like a fundamental level for lions and sharks and starfish and praying mantis and snakes and weasels. Actually, weasels are weird because they often eat big stuff. But in general, I picked a bad example as I reeled things off. The others I know about because I'm remembering them from the paper. But This is like, it's not reptiles do this, or fish do this, or desert-dwelling animals do this, or only very big things do this. Basically, carnivores of almost every single shade, size, shape, evolutionary history, environment it lives in, prey type, eats stuff much smaller than it, and usually a juvenile. So what would we expect dinosaurs to do? Well, they're probably doing the same thing. And in fact, it would be very, very weird if they didn't. And so this is a big paper I wrote about 10, 12 years ago now, exploring this and going, hang on, we just seem to assume that it's like every documentary, and T-Rex is fighting this giant Triceratops covered in horns with a giant frill is absolutely not. Why? The babies are about 20 times more numerous, a fifth of the size, and don't have big horns and don't know where to hide. What would you eat? And also, T-Rex does not need to eat something that weighs as much as it. I'm quite a big eater. I cannot eat my own body weight in 3 or 4 days. Not even close. So why would it even do this? Natural selection is going to get rid of animals that tend to do things like that, because it's very, very likely to get injured, which is basically instantly fatal for a large predator. So that was my starting point. And then you actually dig into the literature that we've got, and lo and behold, people had written about this stuff without kind of realizing what they're sitting on. there's a whole bunch of records of stomach contents where a dinosaur's eaten something, or bitten bones that show healing. So this was clearly an attack that was incomplete and the animal recovered. Every single one of those records was as a juvenile. Every stomach content and every known healed bone was on a juvenile. Well, if big carnivores are preferentially targeting big adults, it's weird how they only ever seem to eat babies and they only ever seem to injure babies. Like, it's the exact opposite result of what you'd expect. And then as a kind of kicker to that, famously, baby dinosaurs are not unknown, but extremely rare in the fossil record, despite the fact that adults are laying tens to hundreds of eggs at a time. Well, that's weird. If an adult lays 100 eggs every year, and an adult might live for 10 or 20 years, why aren't there 10,000 babies for every adult? Why is it, in fact, about one baby for every 10 adults? Actually, it's about 1 in 20. It's about 5%. Well, because they were eaten. If you eat them, you can't become a fossil. You've been broken up and digested, and what comes out at the other end does not make for a nice fossil skeleton. So that's where they are, and that's why we can't find them. They've been destroyed. So all of this evidence ties in together beautifully, but ultimately it derives from an understanding of the behavior of predatory animals.
Yes. Makes complete sense. You said so many things there that were of interest. You said the adults live 10 to 20 years. Is that what we think with adult dinosaurs?
I mean, I'm always a bit cautious whenever I say, or whenever I get a question of like, did dinosaurs X? So they're around for about 160, 170 million years. They're living on every continent, in every environment. So we have them down in Antarctica, which was not anything like as cold as it is now down there. But certainly there was stuff living in the northern hemisphere, like northern Canada, northern Europe, northern Russia, that would have been very similar to modern winters that we experience now. But deserts, rainforests, coastal plains, deep forests, mountains, and all the rest of it. And we found about 1,500 species named so far. That number could be in the multiple thousands. I wouldn't be at all surprised if there were 10 or 20,000 species of dinosaurs plus. We've just only found so many so far. So when you say, like, how long did a dinosaur live? It's not a million miles off asking how long does a mammal live? And it's like, well, shrews, about 18 months if you're lucky. Blue whales, 150 years. So it's hard to get a really clear answer. But I think the oldest thing we found is something like about 35, 40. So actually, they don't live very long. Humans and the apes are a bit weird, but things like killer whales, things like elephants, rhino, hippo, giraffe, the big stuff, if they don't get killed as a baby, if they reach maturity and hit full adulthood, these are animals which are living 20, 30, 40 years plus. In general, the bigger the animal, the longer you live. So when we have sauropods that might have hit 50 tons, 10, 12 elephants welded together, and they're only living as third as long a lifespan as an elephant, that's a bit odd. They do at least violate a few rules on that front. On the other hand, aging a dinosaur skeleton, difficult. We haven't done it for very many. It's certainly possible we've randomly picked a few bad examples, or our data isn't working the way we think it is, and so our answers aren't as clear as they'd like, or we fundamentally miscalculated. We're assuming X is happening and actually Y is happening, and so we're out by a factor of 2 or 3.
Right.
I think we've dated the Sue, the big T-Rex that's held in Chicago. I think she was dated to something like 26, 27.
Wow.
Which is still, this is an animal that's 6-7 tons. This is a big, that is bigger than most large adult African elephants. And they get to like 50, 60, 70. So still quite young in the grand scheme of things. But that's a real age for an animal.
Yeah, I find that really interesting because, am I right in saying things like Greenland sharks, they're like 300 years old, 400 Greenland sharks plus, that were alive in the Renaissance period. There were ones around.
They're super, super low metabolism and super, super slow growing, which dinosaurs are the opposite. Dinosaurs were, it's a very unscientific term, but for a non-technical audience, they were warm-blooded. They were similar to us and birds. They were warm, they stayed warm, they generated their own heat to keep warm. And the benefits that come with that, one of which is very rapid growth. Greenland sharks, basically living in freezing Arctic waters with very low metabolism, so they're very slow growing. So yeah, but then again, the inverted commas cold-blooded animals do tend to live very long lives. You know, there's is it giant clams are supposed to live to 200 or 300. Giant tortoises get to over 100. Some of the big snakes are supposed to get into like 20, 30, 40, despite not being that big compared to most other large vertebrates. Similar for some of the big sharks. So yeah, being big gives you a longer lifespan, but being warm tends to shorten that.
It's really interesting. I really would have been off by quite a lot in a pub quiz if I was asked how long these dinosaurs live, because I just assumed if you're investing all this energy into growing this really large organism that they're going to be around a while. They're sturdy, they're rigid animals. Do we know how what were the most common forms of death?
Well, again, most of them are being eliminated before they get to anything like that size. So in terms of population structure, they would be far more like reptiles than mammals or birds. The analogy I tend to give, if you've been lucky enough to go out on safari or to a place that has things like crocodiles, so like the Everglades, alligators, but close enough, and you walk around and just look, you'll see the odd small one, but mostly what you see are the big ones sitting in the water or basking on the banks. You're like, oh right, there's lots of big crocs around. And then if you go out at night with a torch, suddenly there's hundreds of little pairs of eyes lighting up.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, well, but these are all the diddy ones. And so just like dinosaurs, you've got these massive adults, but they're actually relatively few and far between, because if you're laying, anything from 50 to 100 eggs, and it might take them 5 to 10 years to get to adult size and reproductive age themselves, you're going to have an awful lot of babies and not many adults. But the thing is, you've then also got to, well, not you have to, but like ecology and nature is whittling down those 10,000 babies to a similar number of adults, which means there's an insane juvenile mortality. And that's, they'll die from accidents and diseases and, drown and this, that, and the other, but mostly they're going down the gullet of something else. What killed the vast majority of dinosaurs is being eaten by some kind of carnivore. But again, once you get big, just like elephants and rhino and hippo, once you get above a certain size, you're not immune, but you're also not far off it. Particularly the sauropods, so the diplodocus-like animals with a great big long neck and a great big long tail. They're living in environments where they are massively, massively bigger than the nearest thing that could conceivably try and eat them. We are talking, certainly for the big ones, things like brachiosaurs that might be 30 plus tons. And you're talking about maybe a 1.5, 2 ton carnivore. It's the biggest thing in that ecosystem. You're 15 times heavier. This isn't a lion trying to hunt an elephant. This is like a cheetah trying to hunt an elephant. It's like, it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
And even the smaller stuff is going to be 3 or 4 or 5 times that size. And so again, remember back to that like 25% rule. The vast majority of carnivores are taking stuff that's a quarter of their mass. And when we're talking about something that's 4 or 5 times their mass plus, it's at the right opposite end of the scale. And I'm sure there were some weird specialists that did that. Again, we have them. Weasels do that. Lynx are weird in that they regularly tackle adult deer, which are multiple times their size. So there are some carnivores that end up specializing for really big stuff. And again, as ever, every Attenborough narration, they're looking for the young, but they're also looking for the old and the sick.
Yeah.
If you're ill or injured or just really old and you can't really run, Diplodocus can't run at the best of times, but a big old adult that, is really slow and ponderous and can't swing round or can't kick out at anything, something's going to come along and nail it. Is a 1 ton Allosaurus regularly hunting 15 ton Diplodocus? No. Even a group of them, it's just not worth your while. There's far more common prey that's far easier to get hold of and far less vulnerable. And again, one accident, a Diplodocus is going to have a very slow kick or a very lumbering like tail whip or try and hit you with its head or something, and it'll probably miss. It'll probably miss many, many, many times. But if it connects, that could be a broken leg. And that's literally game over. So, the once you start getting big, and there were small dinosaur species, this isn't for everything, but for the big stuff, once you start getting big, you're more or less immune from typical predation events.
Right. I'm curious if in the next few decades, some data will come out which is strong evidence that we have incorrectly dated some of those larger dinosaurs, and maybe that once they do kind of escape that predation size and they reach escape velocity from most predators, do they actually live a lot longer? But just that information has been removed in 100 million years of environmental change.
Yeah, I mean it's perfectly plausible. I'm really not an expert when it comes to dating them. Basically, it's cutting up bones and counting growth rings, just like a tree. And there are lots of ways that can vary that and kind of skew some of those results and be misleading. But at the same time, I generally trust my colleagues that they keep coming, multiple different research groups using different techniques coming to the same answer. That's probably the best answer. But yeah, it is notable that for their size and based on what we know of living animals, they do seem to be unusually short-lived.
Very interesting. What else do you think most people get wrong about dinosaurs?
I mean, just about everything. Yeah. at a basic level, and without trying to be kind of a cheap shot and dismissive, but it's like I think there is a general pattern that it's a short version actually is that there's an awful lot of dinosaur books out there for kids, vast numbers, and some of them, if you actually take a look on the inside, they'll say, reprinted from such and such, and then you look that one up and it's like, first printed in 1985. And I'm not kidding. I've seen books in the last few years that have those kinds of dates on them, on 1995.
Wow.
30 years old. And it's like, well, you'll be shocked to learn that in the last 30 years, we've added a fair bit of our knowledge and understanding on dinosaur biology, and just where they lived and what they did and how they did it and what species we had and how old they got and what killed them off. And you'll still see stuff that is, and those books contain stuff from the 60s and the 50s. Right. And a lot of them were written by non-experts. And so there's just this, perpetuation of outdated ideas and outdated myths. And I'm very sympathetic because as a kid, you just hoover up everything that's put in front of you. And as an adult, whether a parent or a friend or a relative, you're just going, oh, that book looks nice. Little Johnny or little Susie will like it. And you just buy it and hand it over. You don't know. Of course you don't. But it then means I just run into people going, is it really true that they such and such? And I literally have had them where I'm like, yeah, we worked out that was probably wrong in about 1955. and it's still like in books that people are reading today. And I only wish I was exaggerating. And then, frankly, the modern Jurassic World, just going to say Jurassic Park, the Jurassic World series, only adds to that because I know it's fiction, you know it's fiction, but a lot of people don't seem to have worked that out. As in, they go, well, it was in the film, and I know they speak to paleontologists when they make these films, so that's accurate. And it's like, no, it isn't. I don't think MI5 have watches with lasers in them and, cars with machine guns in the hood, because James Bond is fiction. Tyrannosaurus existed as a species. Yes, it looked sort of like that. After that, we're kind of running out of accuracy. We really are. And again, there's a weird thing there because the original Jurassic Park, when it came out, was, for its time, really pretty good. It was quite a big advance in the presentation of dinosaurs to the general public and its appreciation of science, though it had issues even then, and there's some fictionalized stuff going on and all the rest of it. But as I say, that came out in, what was it, 93, 95, something like that? No idea. So it's now 30 odd years old. There's a bigger gap between the original Jurassic Park and now than there was between the original Jurassic Park and like the classic Ray Harryhausen films and 1 million years BC and Ringo Starr's Caveman and, this kind of era films. So it's like that's the level of advance we've had, and yet the films are still like somewhat understandably, like, quote, in universe, that's the original T-Rex, so she still looks like that. Those are the original velociraptors, or they're modeled on the original velociraptors, so they don't have feathers, even though we now know they have feathers. But it means that people just absorb this. And I have kids coming up to me trying to explain to me, the biology of Indominus Rex. And it's like, that's literally not even a dinosaur. It's made up for the film. They say in the film it's made up for the film. But they're like, no, it's real because it's in the films. And it's like, I'm not suggesting that the Jurassic World franchise necessarily has a responsibility for educating kids, but it is a problem when it's treated as being genuine when it isn't.
Right.
So yeah, sorry, it's a very long answer, but going back to, what do people get wrong? Yeah, at a fundamental level, people know what Diplodocus and Stegosaurus and Triceratops looks like. After that, it runs out pretty quickly most of the time, in my experience.
Can you give maybe one or two concrete examples in the last few decades where either a fossil discovery or putting together a bunch of evidence that we already had really unearthed what you considered a huge shift in paleontology? Some discovery that's came out.
Yeah, I mean, the feathers stuff is obviously a massive one. The idea that birds might have descended from dinosaurs actually goes back to the early 1900s, if not the late 1800s. I forget the exact date, but there was an influential book around 1912 that discussed it at length and then said, but I think it's probably wrong, for some mistaken bits of scientific reasoning, but pointed out a whole bunch of the similarities. And Thomas Henry Huxley, the very famous biologist who was a friend of Darwin's, had looked at this problem and went, birds have an awful lot in common with a handful of dinosaurs. And bear in mind, at this point, we had very few dinosaurs and not much material at all to work from. And then getting into the 60s and 70s, there was kind of a rediscovery of this idea with a whole bunch of new finds. And it got to the point, I think, by kind of the late 70s, early 80s, that the vast majority of paleontologists, 3/4, 80% plus, were very happy with the idea that birds were probably dinosaurs. And there was a bunch of people who really disagreed. And then in the end of the 90s and getting into the early 2000s, we started finding these feathered dinosaurs in China. And it's like, well, they can't fly. They predate the earliest birds that we have at the time, and they're completely covered in feathers, but they're very, very distinctly and definitively dinosaurs, including very rapidly, something about 2005, we had a feathered tyrannosaur. It's like, well, they ain't flying. It was a small one, but still. So that, not only completely nailed down the last of that resistance to the idea that birds were not dinosaurs, though amazingly it took a very long time to die. Still a couple of people go, no, you've definitely got it all wrong, despite the mountain of evidence that really supports this. But also it then really firms up the idea that, well, if birds really are dinosaurs, that tells us an awful. We've been looking at bird biology and going, well, maybe this is quite influential in how we should interpret some of this stuff. But now, of course, it's extremely influential. They are literally dinosaurs. When we say dinosaurs went extinct, you need to basically add brackets, except birds, because the pigeon, the swan, the starling, the sparrow in your garden, as well as penguins, ostriches, and albatross, and parrots, and kiwis, and everything else are literally living dinosaurs. They are literally dinosaurs. There are about 11,000 species alive today. But then all the stuff that goes with that. Feathers insulate. Insulate keeps you warm. That relates to the idea that they're probably warm-blooded and staying warm, that they're relatively active. Birds are smarter on average than other reptiles. Does that tell you maybe something about dinosaur intelligence? Dinosaurs had to shrink. Most dinosaurs are really quite big. Birds are mostly very tiny, including the first birds that we have in the Mesozoic. So about 160 million years ago are our first bird fossils. They're crow-sized, quite big actually by modern bird standards compared to things like sparrows and wrens, but really very, very small compared to tyrannosaurs, for example, which 7 tons and 10, 12 meters long. So yeah, that singular discovery, really kind of revolutionized and refocused a lot of research that was going into interpreting dinosaurs and trying to work out what's going on. And then, of course, that's also then the question of flight and what's going on with the origin of flight, because people are really very interested in that as well.
It's very cool. Can you kind of lay out how that process might have gone? So there were fossils discovered in China. They
Mhm.
looked like they were Tyrannosaurus Rex and other similar dinosaurs. It looked like they had feathers. What happens in that step then? It gets plugged in. You take a load of photos. It gets plugged into a computer. You create a like. How does that actually work?
So I mean, the main thing to do initially, at least, was just take really, really detailed, high resolution photos. Ironically, the first couple of things we found, the feathers are very weird, not very well preserved, and it's kind of hard to make out. So it was a bit of more of a smudge or a stain on the rock than anything else. But within a couple of years, we had much clearer ones, and certainly we had stuff that was very similar to modern feathers. So I should say a lot of dinosaurs, and it's a group called the theropods, so the carnivorous dinosaurs that go on to produce birds. T-Rex, Allosaurus, Velociraptor, Spinosaurus, Coelophysis, Ceratosaurus, all these animals are generally large bipeds. They had feathers, but they had feathers that you'd see on things like a baby chick. So single filaments. They would look more like hair on a mammal than they would feathers as we tend to think of modern birds. But again,
Right.
baby birds in a nest, even fluffy chicks, or even those really kind of wet, horrible things like pigeons. Pigeon babies look absolutely horrific. But yeah, single, simple filament. So we had a bunch of them like that. And it's like, well, it looks like hair, but it's probably not hair. They're basically reptiles. We know that simplified feathers appear in young birds. This is probably the same kind of thing. They're about the same length. They're about the same size. They're clearly flexible because they're preserved slightly wavy and spread out and smushed a bit on the slabs of rock. If we take very high resolution photos of them, you can see that some of them appear to be hollow. That is what you'd expect. Actually, many hairs don't tend to be hollow, but very simple feathers do. So that's another thing that they have in common. But really, it was getting them into a scanning electron microscope. And once you start doing that, you can actually see that they have more in common with the microstructure of feathers. And at least a couple of them were preserved well enough we could get a dodgy, but as in not very good, but still sitting clearly on one side or the other of the type of protein that was preserved. So most skin and hair and fingernails and claws and feathers and all this other stuff in reptiles and mammals and birds and other things is keratin. But there's multiple types of keratin. And actually, I got to remember which way around it is now. I think it's beta keratin that birds primarily have, and mammals and reptiles have both alpha and beta keratin. Well, we could get a signal from some of these dinosaur feathers, and it's beta keratin only, which again is not a definitive signal, but it certainly sits on the right side of the evidence that you'd expect that these are a feather ancestor if that development has already taken place at this point. So that was pretty much it. And then, the real computer stuff actually comes from building the family trees, because we're analyzing hundreds and then rapidly thousands of individual data points and anatomical characteristics, basically sticking them into a big, complicated nearest neighbor algorithm that says which things are nearest to each other and which things are similar but a bit different, and which are similar but a bit different to that, and so on and so forth, and build a family tree. And when you have that, you start seeing the acquisition of characters over time. And lo and behold, now we have really good family trees for these things. The simplest feathers turn up in the earliest dinosaurs or the earliest theropods. Later on, we start getting more complicated feathers. Later on, we start getting more complicated feathers. And by the time you're into things actually like Velociraptor, you have very bird-like feathers in the group that are closest to birds. And we do have some of them. So I've just talked about all the simple stuff, but actually there's several different groups that are very close to birds indeed. And if you look at the fossils, if you really know your feather anatomy, you'll see the differences, but it's not a million miles off from a feather you could pick up on the ground now, preserved on an animal that's 120, 130 million years old. So it's really quite clear that those things are present.
Very cool. Good example. I'm curious with everything you mentioned there about the process, how or if AI has already impacted any parts of that process. Do you see AI doing anything revolutionary for paleontology, for recreating models, for creating more sophisticated biomechanics?
Well, we've been using it already, actually. it's just the large language models that everyone's become used to in the last 2 or 3 years is a very different kettle of fish to kind of classic machine learning. And we've been playing with that for a while. Not a lot yet because it's early days, but it's been used for categorizing things like fossil plankton. Some colleagues of mine have used it for categorizing fossil teeth of various dinosaurs. So loads and loads and loads of little teeth not attached to jaws. But yeah, you can train the computer model on complete skulls and complete jaws and teeth, where we know exactly which tooth belongs to which species, and then going, right, can you now look at all these hundreds of random little bits, some of which are broken or chipped, or you're seeing them at a slightly weird angle, or of course there's intraspecific variation, so they're not always going to look exactly like each other. Which do you think go where? And lo and behold, it can sort them all out for us. And it's very, very good at that sort of thing. So in that early way, at least, yeah, we've been using it for 5 or 6 years already, I think, in terms of the sort of stuff you're talking about of, building much more complicated models and things like this. I think that will come. It's not going to come for ages because paleo is fundamentally an underfunded subject. We're often grabbing or hanging off the coattails of someone's much sexier project. Someone's going to use this for categorizing human biomechanics because we want it for physiotherapy, or we want it for, the army want to know which soldiers are likely to get injured, or we're going to build next generation prostheses, or some big tech AI startup in Silicon Valley is going to try and build a mech suit for soldiers, or something like that's going to happen.
Right.
And then when that's been on the market for a few years, we're going to go, oh, now it doesn't cost $100,000 and someone's already developed, $500,000 and someone's developed all the software. We'll just take the human bones out and plug the T-Rex bones in, and we'll see what it can do. And so that's the sort of thing that I think we often tend to do, as in we're not like last to the party, but we don't have the funding to develop this kind of stuff.
Right.
But eventually it comes down the line and is accessible or adaptable for the sort of things we need. But we're still always going to be limited by the fact that, well, how many complete 3D skeletons have you got? The answer's hovering right around naught.
Is it really?
As in truly, truly complete of absolutely every single bone, well preserved and in 3D. I can't think of one. I bet there's a couple out there. But, I mean, for example, there's this fantastic, I think it's an Albertosaurus, a big tyrannosaur. In Canada, it's held at the Royal Tyrrell Museum in Alberta. And it's like one of the most pristine, in fact, I'd say it's the most pristine large skeleton of a dinosaur I've ever seen. This thing's 5, 6, 7 meters long. It's a big animal. And yet it's missing like 2 tailbones and 1 toe bone and a bit of an arm and a couple of ribs. Right. It's 99+% complete, and those bits we have are very, very good. We've got the toe on the other side. We've got the tailbones before and after, so we kind of know what those two look like. Yes. But it's not actually 100% complete. But even things of that quality, yeah, you're talking about half a dozen. And so we really don't have that many. There's lots of others where we can do a good enough job, like Tyrannosaurus itself. Sue that I mentioned, Sue has a very squished skull. Sue has a bunch of weird bones missing, but we have those bones from other T-Rex skeletons. It would be very easy to just scale them up a bit and fit them in and make a very, very good T-Rex from like 3 or 4 others. But yeah, even the number of species we could do that for, it's probably low double digits. I mean, I don't know off the top of my head, but it's not like we can go ahead, even for things that, where we do have dozens of specimens. When you have very large numbers, it's often because some disaster has overwhelmed them, and so you've got hundreds of things that are all crushed and mixed up. Or it's often sites like in China, where we have a zone of exceptional preservation, which preserves things like feathers and claws and skin and even eyes and stuff like this. But it tends to flatten them, so it's roadkill. So you get all the soft tissue where you like, wow, I can get the skin and I can see how long its claws are, and I can count the number of scales on the feet, and I can see what size and shape its feathers are on what bit of the body. but it looks like a steamroller went over it a week ago. Like the bones are shattered within the rock. So the 3D shape, which is kind of what you want if you want to know where the muscles go and therefore how strong the muscles are and how they, but you can't do it. Or at least it's going to be a lot of kind of guesstimate to put it back together. And of course, with that sort of thing, you're basically adding error to error to error to error.
Right.
And so it might always be your best guess down the midline, but you don't know that you're not getting further and further and further away from reality. So I'm sure that's coming. I've said before, and I'll say it again. I think probably decades away, but we're in the zone of like being able to walk up to a skeleton in a museum, because we can do almost all these steps already. For example, so LiDAR scanning, you can do this on some of the next generation iPhones now. So they basically take enough photos and enough like radar scan that you can build a 3D model in your phone of a skeleton.
Right.
We're already manually undistorting the bones. Well, this one's crushed, but you can tell it because the other side's okay. So let's mirror image it, get along the midline and build the crushed side from the uncrushed side. Or we've got the neck bones. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 9, 10, 11. Okay, we can work out what 7 is from the others and the pattern. We're doing that manually. Then we're manually adding the muscles because we know roughly where they go. Then we're sticking it in another computer and going, right, how does the legs move? How strong is that thing? We think it's this heavy, so how strong would it have? How big would those muscles have to be to make it stand up or make it move quickly or turn? How much do the joints articulate? Can it bend the neck that far or only this far? But we're doing it all manually. And so, I think in 20 years, you're going to walk into, the Natural History Museum, or now they've put it outside the Diplodocus skeleton, and you're going to walk around it with your phone and just take all the photos, and then it will build the model, and then it will fix the mistakes, and then it will edit out the broken bits, and then it will take the frame off it, and then it'll add the muscles on, and then it will do a mass estimate and tell you how fast it can move. And at that, that's, we can do it. It's just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours of work.
Yes.
And so if it's like an entire PhD to go, how did this animal stand up? It's amazing we can do it, but it's profoundly limiting data. When it gets to the point that you can automate this and with just a bit of human input, you can do one in a week.
Right.
It means a PhD student now goes, right, I'm going to study the evolution of this across 100 species, across 100 million years, because I can do that in 6 months. And they're like, wow, like now, it's going to go absolutely through the roof. And that's often how these things go, when we could only look at skulls that were basically whole or cut in half so you could sort of see inside the brain. We could do quite a bit. Once we had CT scans that could penetrate the bone and rock and build the internal structure of the brain as a computer model. Yes. Well, we can do it for dozens of species, quite a lot of money and quite a lot of time, but you can do it. And then, we were already tracking brain size evolution and sense evolution. It's going to be the same kind of thing, I think.
For me, it seems a lot like AlphaFold, DeepMind's company, the first company to basically solve protein folding. To solve the configuration of one protein used to take a PhD student basically a full project, 4 or 5 years, and it was considered a very successful PhD if they were able to do that.
If you did a protein,
and now we basically have the protein configuration of I don't know how many tens of thousands, hundreds of
whatever
thousands.
you want. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Like it might be the case now that an individual PhD student, as you say, with these armed models that are built tailor-made for paleontological reconstruction, whatever you want to call it, they can just accomplish so much more. What I'm really interested in is brain as a neuroscience podcast. Do we have any fossilized dinosaur brain?
So there is one putative one that's actually from the UK. So there's a...
Wow.
I need to be careful with my wording. There is a lump of rock. So, of course, it's fossilized. So it would be a lump of rock.
Yes.
There's a lump of rock from the Isle of Wight, which has been said to be at least a partially preserved brain.
Wow.
I'm not trying to be dismissive of it, though some people have said it isn't. It's a lump of rock. You're misinterpreting things. One of the original authors of that paper is an extremely respected and senior scientist who is not just going to throw his name behind some random piece of rock if he's not very convinced.
Right.
But ultimately, it's incredibly hard to say and incredibly hard to know because brains are squishy.
Yes.
And so, yeah, even in the sites where we get of exceptional preservation, and some of these ones, the Chinese ones I've worked on, I was a postdoc in China for 3 years. We have salamanders and frogs, but it's preserved the gills and preserved the eyes, or at least flattened stains of them. But again, you can get microstructures out of these and other things like this. It really is the original tissue, which is fossilized, but is present. In that context, it's far from impossible that a dinosaur sank in a bog, and just like we get bog humans and things like that, where the acids and all the rest of it means there's basically no decay and it all effectively gets pickled, and then just gets covered over by a ton of sand after an earthquake or a flood or whatever, and ultimately compacts and becomes a fossil. It is not impossible,
right,
that a brain for a dinosaur could preserve like that. But you got to remember how insanely unlikely it is. Because we have loads of dinosaurs preserved from bog equivalent sediments, and they don't preserve very much soft tissue. When they do, it's skin. Skin is very, very tough stuff, particularly in reptiles where it's scaly. Brains are very, very squishy and soft, and are the sort of things which will just fall apart anyway, whether bacteria are eating them or not. So there is one. I think it is credible that is what it is.
Yes.
Not everyone is very happy with the idea, I think, is perhaps the best way of putting it. And I have no dog in this fight because I don't know my way around either brains or soft tissue preservation and preservation mechanisms and the lithology of how these things fossilize and what you can tell from rock and what rock kind of can and can't do in the fossilization process. So I'm profoundly ignorant of all this stuff. What I do know is some people who I really trust quite a lot with their knowledge say it definitely is, and others say it definitely isn't. So
very, very cool.
There is a lump of rock which may or may not be a dinosaur brain.
The lump of rock has to contain DNA. No, is there any DNA of a dinosaur that's been fossilized and extracted?
Nah, so
No?
in a similar way, there are alleged, and again, and I'm not saying alleged as in, allegedly he robbed the bank when you watched him do it. It's like, I don't know, and I'm not in a position to argue about this. There are credible scientists have published what they claim to be preserved protein fragments that are 70 million years old.
Wow.
Whether they are or not, I am not even remotely qualified to judge. Again, not a preservation expert, not a biomolecules expert at all.
Yes.
Again, there are people who say, yes, I think this is very convincing. There are people who say this is completely unconvincing. You've got contamination problems or yada, yada, yada. So I don't know. I think it's at least vaguely plausible. But again, we're talking protein fragments. We're talking, we sort of said that with that beta keratin stuff. There's bits of stuff which have a signature consistent with it being like a reptile protein. But the difference between that and a protein is like the difference between finding, a burnt, a flattened, shredded bit of a tire and an entire car. They're that far apart. Like, there was probably a car there. We've got a car tire with like Mercedes logo on it. Great. It's a pristine 1973 Mark, I don't know cars or whatever, whatever model. No, it's not. It's just like people think that, like, oh, didn't you hear? They found they found a car. It's like, no, they found a broken hubcap.
Yes.
Now, there was a car there, or they probably wouldn't have had a broken hubcap, but that's really not what you've got. And that's to get a protein. And like, it's a dreadful analogy, I've realized now I've started, so let's carry on. But, like the difference between a protein and DNA is like the difference between, that Mercedes and 20 different jet fighters with all the complexity that goes into them, with all the different ones all stuck together.
Right.
And so, yeah, we have we've got a broken hubcap, and people are like, cool, so you can recreate dinosaurs from their DNA. And it's like, I cannot build all the world's jet fighters from a broken hubcap. Even if I get lots and lots and lots and lots of hubcaps, I'm probably, or half an axle and a dashboard and a steering wheel and a brake light. I can't build you an F-35 or an F-16 or
Yes.
whatever else it is. It's not like that. So yeah, DNA, just the odds of that existing are, I mean, you never say never because the fossil record is weird, but I think for a while, I think the half-life for DNA, it's in like the tens of thousands of years, which means after a few 100,000, you're down to, incredible rarity. And
Yes.
I think there was an argument that something like I'm talking about stuff like really not my area, but I think it was the argument was something like over about 800,000 was basically the chances were nil.
Okay.
And then someone turned some up that was something like 1.5 million years old. But again, it's a few this is a bit of a wing and some landing gear type stuff.
I get you.
And that's 1.5 million. And we've got to go back at least 65. So much further with all of that entails, because, every year there's a chance that it gets wet or it gets squished or it gets too hot or it gets pulled under or a volcano goes off next to it, or all the other millions of things that can go wrong and destroy that. And so, so over every million years and every 5 million years and every 10 million years, this just vanishes down, if it even preserved well in the first place. And DNA is not a particularly robust molecule, again, compared to stuff like hair and skin, which is why when you're walking along the beach or the side of the road, you see bones all the time. You see feathers, you see clumps of hair. You'll find, I've got a lovely photo in my new book of a dead seagull on a beach, and it's just a skeleton and feathers, because the feathers are stuck to the bone. And keratin's really tough and basically nothing digests it. So all the fat and muscle and viscera and eyes and things like that have gone, and it's got like webbed feet and some feathers and a skeleton with a beak on it, and the rest is gone. DNA's on the side of the stuff that's gonna go relatively early. So yeah, I again, never say never, but I wouldn't hold your breath.
I completely, that makes a lot of sense. I have to bring it up because it was in the news a lot in the last couple of weeks. I presume you've heard of Colossal Biosciences.
Yes.
I have to get your opinion. Just while we're on the topic, I have to get your opinion. What do you think on their mission and what they're trying to achieve?
I think they can't do it. I think they shouldn't do it. I think what they said they've done, they haven't done. That thing's not a direwolf. I mean, this is the one thing I can argue with actually some confidence, because a lot of my training is in taxonomy, so the identification and recognition of species and other lineages and what constitutes a species. I teach courses on it. I did a master's in it, and I've named a couple of dozen species. And their arguments for how they're defining their species is not one that any taxonomist would give the slightest time of day to. It's weirdly convoluted and folds back on itself, and this is from press release stuff, or apparently they got their own Reddit subreddit that is owned by them, and they were arguing on this. So this is is near enough an official spokesperson making these. Oh well, no, we're using this system of taxonomy. That doesn't exist. The definition you've used doesn't match the name you've given, and it includes data you don't have.
I don't think people really understand taxonomy and understand the rules that go into it and know. Explain just a little bit about that, because it's not very common knowledge.
Yeah, so taxonomy is an odd one because it is something of a science and it is also something of an art. So there's a whole bunch of what we call taxonomic species concepts, which is how do you define a species? And people have probably heard the school one is two groups that can reproduce and produce fertile offspring. Yeah, I can't do that on dinosaurs, curiously enough. And equally, what I use, which is anatomy, and so what's called the morphological species concept, the anatomy and structure of a thing, you can't use that on bacteria because they all look the same. So there are literally there's something like about 18 species concepts in theory regularly use. In practice, it ultimately comes down to about 3 or 4.
Right.
There's a wonderful XKCD comic about this, about standards, and two scientists going, there's all these different standards out there. There's 20 standards for this. What if we created a new universal standard that solved the problem? Next frame, there are now 21 standards. This is the taxonomic species problem, or the species concept problem. You cannot have a species concept that will work for asexual plants and lichen, which are a mixture of fungi and algae and sometimes something else, and dinosaurs and viruses. Like, it can't be done. So, or at least if you do end up with one of these supposedly overarching ones, it's so completely impractical that it never works most of the time. So, for example, there's a thing called the phylogenetic species concept, which relies on the evolutionary history of these lineages. Well, most of my dinosaur fossils are known from a couple of bones, so I don't know what their evolutionary history is, so I can't apply it. And so this is why I say it's like a bit of an art and a bit of science. And also, taxonomists tend to work in their own fields. So actually, the standards for naming a dinosaur species aren't quite the same as the standards for naming a pterosaur species. Pterosaurs are the flying reptiles that lived with dinosaurs. I work a lot on both. Because we're working with different data sets with different historical biases and different availability of information and what we understand about their biology. So actually, it kind of makes sense that they end up being different, but it also means that a dinosaur species probably isn't quite the same thing as a pterosaur species, let alone a beetle or a virus or a bacteria. But there are at least a ton of rules. There's literally volumes of them. I mean, nowadays it's all online, but in the old days, like encyclopedia-sized volumes of rules of how we should try and do taxonomy and how we should try and justify our species and use names consistently and practically. But yeah, this one of the colossal things was like, oh yeah, we call these direwolves because they have the appearance and behavior of direwolves. And you're like, well, first of all, we don't know the behavior of direwolves because they're extinct. And secondly, although you have got some gene sequences, what you've mostly modified, according to your information, so I mean, I don't know, but I'm literally going from what they said. We've modified the shape of the ears. And it's like, right, but we don't have their ears. We have a skull which doesn't preserve ears. So you say it's the same thing as a direwolf because it's got the ears which we can't see, and it's got the same behavior which we don't know what it is. Like literally, it's just like there's no possible way you can define species by their soft tissue appearances. We do it all the time. This bird looks basically identical to that one, but this one's red and this one's blue, and they don't reproduce with each other. Cool. That sounds like a good definition to me. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. There are behavioral species definitions. The one I always remember is there's supposed to be a frog in Australia where you basically end up with two populations, which one breeds in the wet season and one breeds in the dry season. They basically look identical. Even genetically, they appear to be identical. But they're not breeding with each other because if you breed in December, you don't breed in July. And so they are separate. So actually, the easiest way to define them is by their behavior. Again, so there's nothing inherently wrong with that, but only when you know. And we don't know. So,
Yeah.
And yeah, by their own admission, they've modified a handful of genes.
Yes.
And this really is kind of playing around with a tabby cat and calling it a tiger. And it's like, these are large carnivorous canids, but they're quite distantly related in some way, not just to wolves, but all modern canids, jackals and foxes and other things like this. Actually, I'm not sure they're that close to foxes, but anyway, other stuff. But yeah, like this isn't how you define it. And of course, we have definitions of species of direwolves, and it's based on the anatomy because that's the data we have. If you can manipulate them such that the animal that you've generated, when it's dead, or if you go and CT scan it, and I've got its skeleton and I can compare it, then we can talk. But you don't appear to have made any of those changes beyond making it a bit bigger. You've
Right.
actively done something which is almost certainly wrong in making it white, because they were mostly subtropical. These are not animals that usually hang around in the snow when they live in Mexico and California, and even down to North and South America. So, yeah, I don't think it's much of anything,
Yeah.
to be honest.
I
And
thought,
the idea that you can make mammoths, it's never going to happen. It just won't. And even if you can, even if tomorrow they went, we have a viable embryo, which thanks to some Jurassic Park level manipulation, we have produced what we think is a viable embryo that is like 100% mammoth. We somehow synthesized the entire mammoth DNA and somehow got it to fold properly and somehow dealt with all the other problems that will come with that. But we've done it. Like, right, how are you going to get it born? The only thing that can gestate that is an elephant, an endangered species. You should not be messing around with endangered species to produce an extinct species for an ecosystem that doesn't exist.
right.
Just don't do it.
I
So, yeah, as I said, I don't think they can, though I don't know anything like enough about DNA to say, but I don't think they should, which is a far bigger problem.
Yes. The first thing I thought was, wow, those things are really cute. And then I looked into it and I was thinking that their whole marketing was genius and their marketing was better than their genetics. You know, the whole thing with Game of Thrones and bringing in the direwolves and everything.
Well, and George R.R. Martin,
Yes.
who's mysteriously an author on the preprint.
On the throne. Oh, really? Of the paper?
Yeah.
He contributed to the fiction of the whole thing, I guess.
You said that, not me, if they want to see.
Is there even an ecosystem argument? You could. They're trying.
They've claimed that mammoths would have been ecosystem engineers, and then that would affect the steppe, and then that would affect how that ecosystem functions, and that could cause a lot of carbon capture. I don't know anything like enough about steppe biology and mammoths to say. Maybe, but if the only place that this operates is Russia, you think you might want to speak to them about this. If your long-term goal is to have a breeding population of mammoths to ecosystem engineer Siberia,
Yeah,
I feel the Russians should be consulted on this. You can't just rock up with a guy on the border with a hat going, I've got a delivery for Vladimir. 200 mammoths. Can you sign here, please? Like,
yeah.
Because they say they're going to do it in a few years. I mean, I don't believe them, but that's what they say. I feel this is the sort of conversation, you look at the effort that goes into trying to move a handful of elephants from one game reserve in Africa to another game reserve in Africa, where both game reserves want this to happen.
Yeah.
And it can take 18 months to 2 years. I feel like this is going to be an issue.
Yeah, it's crazy hubris, right? And kind of playing God, thinking that you can just artificially implant an extinct animal in an ecosystem and then somehow predict how it will operate within that ecosystem and how every other component will operate with its existence as well. Talk about magnifying errors.
Yeah, exactly. And if there's stuff if you can do that sort of thing, there's plausible stuff you could do. So the one that people keep bringing up with good reason is something like the thylacine or Tasmanian wolf or Tasmanian tiger. This thing went extinct as little as 70, 80 years ago, probably a bit over 100, but maybe a couple of them hung around. Tasmania has changed quite a lot. They used to be all over Australia. Population was reduced by humans down to Tasmania, hence the name. But yeah, Tasmania has lots of farmland. It's had lots of logging. It's not the place that it was. But there are good chunks of Tasmania which don't look a million miles away from what they looked like 100 and even 500 years ago. Right. There are no large natural predators, and this was the animal that filled that niche. And so that ecosystem still exists, and that animal should be in that ecosystem.
Right.
So if you could bring that back, you're not really messing around with something any more than humanity already has by messing up Tasmania with farmland and logging and sheep and rats and pigs and other things getting there.
Yes.
But there's no reason to think if you could, magic up 50 Tasmanian tigers, particularly if you put them in a preserve and protected them a bit, they wouldn't do fine. Quite possibly, there'd be, even assuming you could reconstruct them properly, maybe they're vulnerable to some, distemper in dogs, which we didn't know they were vulnerable to, or some other disease, or it turns out that actually they were really reliant on a possum species as prey, and that possum has been extinct, but we didn't know that, yada, yada, yada. But there'd be a good shot that it might work.
Right.
Mammoths, we're not at the end of an ice age. We're
right.
not. It's the short version.
I think sort of knowing a little bit about how venture capital works, that the projects that they decided to work on might have been more of the investor pitch than they were,
No.
Right. Maybe I'm being Captain Obvious there, but like it seems like one of them is so obviously a marketing stunt rather than it really has any ecosystem viability. But would you be in favor of something that was a bit more scoped out, like a Tasmanian tiger? Would you think that we should be going down those avenues?
I think that there's still way too many ethical problems with it. It's like, we have all kinds of rules for developing embryos for all kinds of reasons. You don't want to cause unnecessary suffering, and genetic technology is not anything like as advanced that we can go, oh, well, we've got the DNA sequence, so we just bung it in the egg and then everything's fine. It's like, it does not work like that. So, how many, horribly deformed mutants are you going to produce trying to do this? And at what point does it become worth it? Because again, you're right about like venture capitalist funding, and I'm sure it's going to advance some genetic techniques if they've hoovered up millions and hundreds or tens of hundreds of millions in investment. But it's like, right, but how about we cut down deforestation? If I wanted to make the world a better place and you gave me $500 million, would I be better resurrecting Tasmanian tigers if it works, or would I be better off buying a few hundred square kilometers of the Amazon and the Congo and Malaysian and Chinese and Indian rainforests, and putting a fence around them and hiring some guards? I think I know which of those is probably going to protect ecosystem, but save that will save species that have not yet gone extinct, literally. So do that. Or, or build a chain of museums and libraries worldwide to educate people about climate change and human impact and recycling and whatever else it may be. This is kind of like Star Trek level tech. I mean, it's not, but you know where I'm heading. In a non-Star Trek utopian world, while the Amazon's on fire, which should we prioritize?
Yeah, those are way less interesting pitches, though. Libraries, Amazon rainforest versus woolly mammoth.
Because if someone like Bezos or Musk was going to do that, they'd have done it.
Yeah. Let's go to. I wanted you to react. I really wanted to get your opinion on that, and I think that's really helpful because it's been going around. It's gone really viral. I've been seeing so many people react to it. A lot of people just not knowing how to react because it is just a completely novel thing that we've never done before. So everyone's sort of just like, I don't know how I should think about that.
I agree, but I think as is all too often the case, whilst there has been some better coverage, the media basically just went, wow, look at this press release from this venture capitalist firm. We'll give them front page coverage of this amazing thing. And then on line 47, however, Professor such and such said, this is nonsense. Da, 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 da. However, they have said, it's like, no, maybe,
include that,
all the geneticists and all the science ethicists and the paleontologists who've worked on direwolves and ancient DNA and people like me who work on taxonomy, but every single one of whom came out within 5 minutes and went, this is nonsense.
Yeah.
Maybe you should have spoken to them before giving this thing millions in free PR.
Yes.
Or is the media that bad now, or that short of data, or that short of understanding of what media is? Sadly, I think the answer is it probably is.
the whole thing's just driven by clicks, right? It clicks is the attention economy. So like they're just optimizing for clicks on every level,
Yeah, but then you're not a journalist anymore. Would be my
for
argument.
sure. Yeah, absolutely.
As someone who's worked for the Guardian for a bit, and I do know, I know some very good science journalists, but yeah, they're drowned because anything this sexy immediately bypasses the science journalists because it's news now rather than just science. It's this absolute madness of the most scientific thing that's happened is not covered by the people who know anything about it.
Yes, it's a good point. I hadn't thought about that. I really want to go to what I think is some of the coolest dinosaur recreations in animation that I've seen in the last couple of years, which is Life on Our Planet. Morgan Freeman narrated.
Yeah,
on Netflix.
I've only seen a bit of that.
You haven't seen it? I would have expected you to have seen it like 12 times.
No, because I got bored and annoyed with it about half an hour.
Well, I might trigger some of that boredom and at least annoyance now, and I'm hoping to capture it because I was very skeptical of some of the things that Morgan Freeman was coming out with, and I know he obviously was just the narrator, but
yeah.
Like, let's go into a few of these, and I just want you to react to them, and then you can kind of go through different levels.
Yeah,
of
realism, I watched like half or three quarters of the first episode, so the odds are I had not heard this.
Very good.
Tyrannosaurus Rex.
You can see that okay?
Yeah, but I can barely hear it. Okay, I can read the text. Okay. Yeah, so that's annoying me already. The ultimate predator. It's an animal. Like, describe these things as animals.
What do you think about a clip like that?
So this is one of those things where I think it's primarily based on some real work, but I think it's not a great version of it. So there's a guy called Phil Curry in Canada who's published a huge amount on tyrannosaurs, and he published a book, and I'm not sure he ever got it into a full paper, but basically arguing that this is how tyrannosaurs hunted, that it actually was cooperation between adults and juveniles because they could do different things.
Okay.
I think that's nonsense for all the reasons I explained. Like, juvenile mortality is so insanely high that, like, if you're an adult tyrannosaur, you can't hunt effectively unless you have mid-sized babies. Like, well, what happens if they die 1 year? You're now doomed because you can't hunt without them? That seems like it's unlikely to operate. The other problem that you've got is, well, for a start, there's like no modern analog to anything like this at all. There's lots of cooperative hunting between adults and juveniles, but not where they're fundamentally different and then they have roles and without each the other doesn't operate properly.
Right.
But the other problem you're running into is actually those animals, or at least when they're a little bit bigger, the younger ones, you're heading towards sexual maturity. Now, that's then kind of problematic because if you're a reproductively capable offspring, why are you hunting with your parents? They're just going to steal all the food that you just earned when you want to grow yourself and have your own offspring that carry your genetic lineage, not their genetic lineage. And of course, but you're 100% you and your adults are only 50% you.
Right.
And then also in this context, well, if they only operate like that, well, what do males do if they live on their own? So either large adult tyrannosaurs can hunt on their own, in which case you don't need the offspring, or they can't, in which case how are males surviving if they're not living in family groups? So I fundamentally don't think that system operates. I don't think it would evolve because I think it violates how we understand selection for genes and deep behavior and how that operates in that way. I also think like functionally it wouldn't operate ecologically. Then you run into the problem of every documentary ever, which is animals standing silently isn't very interesting. So They're all growling and hissing at each other while 6 feet from the thing they're trying to eat. which it then sees and therefore, or hears and therefore it runs away. So, of course, you won't do that. Then, of course, the Triceratops don't run away. You have no armor and the legs are extremely vulnerable. So dinosaurs are reptiles. Reptiles have basically giant muscles that go from the back of their thigh to about halfway down the tail. That is the single biggest muscle on any side of the body, and that is most of your thrust. So running away from a carnivore and basically giving them your butt to bite is a one bite away from basically being unable to walk. It's like being hamstrung. You're just dead instantly. And instead, you've got an armored head with 1.5 meters long spikes on it. If I'm a Triceratops and a Tyrannosaur is charging towards me, best bet is to stand still, not turn and run away. So yeah. And then the fact that it was very cunningly camouflaged behind a tree, despite being 3.5 meters tall and bright red, it somehow was able to hide behind a tree. And I think they've been very careful with their lighting to make it much more hidden than it would realistically be. Because you can't hide animals like that. Now, maybe you can with that kind of stand of trees, but plenty of tyrannosaurs were actually living in plains. They can't hide behind trees. So maybe in that individual case, it works. But if you're trying to depict the way these animals would have to be able to hunt, they're not ambush animals that are popping out from cover and chasing after something. And then the kind of other thing is that's not really how tyrannosaurs hunt anyway. They're long distance runners. Well, they're not power walkers. The one thing I did really like is the speed of it. Everything's like in slow motion because everything's massive. I was like, how does Tyrannosaur catch anything when it's not very quick? Because it's chasing after a 7 or 8 ton herbivore that's also not very quick.
How quick were they? Do we know? I mean, is there, what's the best estimate?
There are estimates, but this is the kind of thing which is surprisingly hard to do, to like nail down a number. I think we've got them now at something in the realms of like 7-8 meters a second, which is pretty fast, like 20 odd miles an hour. Because basically they've got a really big stride, so they're quick. But they're, at the same time, they're not that quick. You know, when cheetahs can hit 60 miles an hour, certainly 50 plus, plenty of antelope can hit 30, 40. They're not that fast.
But I'm not outrunning one, probably.
No, we wouldn't. But they're long they're good for long distance. They have a bunch of efficiencies built in, which means they regain a lot of energy with each step, or at least they lose less than the average animal, and therefore they're pretty good over medium to long distances. And as I've said all along, these things aren't hunting big adult triceratops.
Yes, that was the other point I was going to mention.
It's more dramatic, but if you want to show what's really typical, it's going to be one getting up to speed and coming out of cover, or more likely doing something much more like wolves or hyena, which is, pretty much just like coming over the hill and just going for something. And the Triceratops is going to be quicker, but the Tyrannosaurus is going to be up to speed. So it's starting at full speed, whereas the Triceratops has got to build up speed, and then it's going to tire faster. So it's very similar to, again, what we see with things like wolves and hyena, and actually even lions, which is, you're fundamentally chasing something faster than you. But if it's going from a standing start and you're already moving, then if you can get close enough before it's got up to top speed, or you can keep going long enough that its burst of speed means that it's tired, but it's still within range that you might catch up, you're going to get to it.
This one I was immediately skeptical of, because it didn't make any sense to me how they could know this information, but I'll just play it and I'll get your thoughts after. And I know I think this is post dinosaurs. I think it's about 6.
Yeah. These look like Forsarakid, so you're much more.
Which means we should have more knowledge on them, maybe. But I'll just play it and get your thoughts, because this is.
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't use the word snarl for a bird, but... Is it supposed to be a male-female
I
pair?
don't know. I think it's male aggression,
That coordinated move.
Okay.
but your guess is as good as mine because I don't know how. So the idea is that they have this really elaborate
Yeah.
sort of ritual, and I was just like, how do they know this? How does Morgan Freeman know this?
So you wouldn't, but elaborate escalation rituals are very common in combat scenarios. I actually recorded another interview a couple of weeks ago, and I was banging on and on about this exact point. Because exactly that, like basically you don't want to get into a fight that you're not sure if you're going to win it or not. But that's true for both of them. And so unless one is obviously bigger or stronger, you don't just launch into 100-mile-an-hour aggression, because what if it turns out the other guy's better than you and then you're about to get lamped? And again, for a big carnivore that's well equipped, that can be fatal. And the analogy I gave is like you'll see it in pub fights. Like, okay, things do kick off, but it starts with people shouting and then they square up to each other and then it's a bit of pushing and shoving before anything really happens.
Makes sense.
Because I don't really want to get into a fight that I'm not sure I'm going to win. And also if it's over a game of pool or a spilled pint, it's probably not worth it. But it's that exact sort of thing. And animals are in the same boat. I could kill him, but maybe he'll kill me. Or maybe I'll kill him, but I'm going to break my leg in the process, in which case I'm basically dead and it's a very Pyrrhic victory. So unless the stakes are incredibly high, this is an opportunity to mate. In particular, this might be my last opportunity to mate if you're an old male or something like that. There is no point going, from 0 to 100. So it's exactly this. It's lots of stereotyped behavior, because it's in everyone's interest to kind of work out. Because, you don't want to get stuck into a fight if you think you're going to lose. That's not worth it. But you also want to make sure first, rather than running away from every fight that you think you might not win, because then you're never going to win one. So there are animals that do lots of stuff like that, and they're just reasonably transposing it. The question then becomes, how fair is it to present it as being knowledge, which was a lot of the criticism of the original Walking with Dinosaurs, is like, well, this is all speculation, or like, we don't know. And it's like, we don't know much of this, but it's also pretty reasonable, and it's the sort of thing that they do. I personally would always prefer they would engage in some sort of ritual. Here is our version of that, or we have lifted this from eagles or secretary birds or deer, even whatever it may be, to show you. But of course, that doesn't make for great narration, so they don't like doing it.
It's an interesting point because, like, I'm a scientific communicator, so what I do is try to communicate complex scientific ideas. And when I saw that, I was like, okay, they're grasping at maybe this behavior being common in birds, and they're extrapolating. But at what point is that just scientific misinformation? Like, because he gives, like, that's a lengthy scene that I couldn't bring entirely. There's like an 8-minute sequence there when he describes an exact process that they walk alongside each other. They, there's details there that they might be just taking from a different bird, but it seems to me to just be misinformation.
Yeah, I mean, I think at that point it's probably heading more down that. I mean, I'm a communicator myself for lots of different ways, and I'm generally not very happy with it. I mean, I always have to kind of bite my tongue when I'm working on documentaries as an advisor and things like this, because you're not going to win every fight. In fact, you don't win most fights. But I also think the stuff I have done or been involved in was better for my involvement. It may not have been great, but it was better with the effort that I put in. And I definitely know of other people who wouldn't have put in that effort or would let things slide that I wouldn't. So I can say from experience, it's not just better for my involvement rather than any academic's involvement. I think it's genuinely better for my involvement. The other problem, of course, you run into is Not that there's that many, though I think there are some like cowboy academics will just say anything if it makes the director happy. But obviously, really profound disagreements over some things, and if one side has a voice and the other doesn't, or something like, the Phil Curry stuff, I'm sure Phil and I are colleagues, never collaborating on anything, but we run into each other occasionally. We always have good chats. It's all very, I think, mutually respectable. I think he knows that I completely disagree with him. It's fine. That's how academia works. But obviously it does then mean that when we're looking for an exciting sequence, should we go for the adults hunting with juveniles and doing this circling British prey, or should we go with what Dave thinks, which is actually it would just run after it for 20 minutes and then eventually bite it? Well, what's coming. And so even though I've got a bunch of colleagues who work on this kind of stuff, I think on average, most people don't really agree with Phil's interpretation, as in I think it's a fairly minority opinion. It may even be as minority as basically just him. But it's a legitimate scientific hypothesis, because of course it's very hard to disprove. I can provide a bunch of evidence where I say I think that this is why it wouldn't work. But, there's even a documentary I worked on where I was the lead consultant, and they put it in. And I went, no, I think this is nonsense. I think there's very good reasons this is nonsense, and I can explain why it's nonsense. They're like, yeah, it's really cool though, isn't it? And you're like, yeah, but you've hired me for my knowledge and expertise as a Tyrannosaur behavior expert, and you're just ignoring me.
Completely, I can see how that would be very frustrating. Very frustrating. Dave, this has been so much fun. I want to get an understanding of the future of paleontology. Like, what are the really big questions that the best paleontologists like yourself in the world are trying to tackle? What technology is going to come out that's going to revolutionize the field? What are you really excited about in the next couple of decades?
Well, conveniently, my previous book tackled these exact subjects. So I've written an entire book on this problem. What I was saying about that was in the final chapter about like technological developments is exactly that kind of like the point where we can just walk into a room and scan a skeleton and immediately work out mechanics, because that feeds back into what you were saying about Triceratops. Like, well, how fast did T-Rex go? Even if we could do a brilliant, perfect calculation of how fast T-Rex could go, it's kind of meaningless unless we know how fast Triceratops could go. So doing one doesn't tell you very much. Doing lots, and then again, as I say, I think they're mostly hunting small Triceratops. Well, how big could the little Triceratops go? Is there a point at which Triceratops get so big that they slow down, that they're probably not able to escape, but they're now big enough that they're probably safe? What does that mean for the smaller T-Rex, which are definitely faster but wouldn't be able to tackle bigger ones? Like, modeling one animal is rarely telling you very much, and so it's that whole suite of data. But in terms of what's coming, I think actually we need to do more of what we can already do, which of course science is very bad at, by which I mean the next thing is always what everyone wants to do. And it's not just researchers, but it's journals and publishing, and therefore getting a job or getting a promotion or getting a research grant or whatever. And I think the best analogy of this is the color stuff. 10, 15 years ago, I'd say not only do we not know the color of dinosaurs, we're never going to know. Turned out we had a mechanism of doing it once a couple of people had worked out, started to look. There's this raft of papers in all the top journals, the color of this dinosaur, the color of this early mammal. We've got stripes, we've got patterns, we've got this, that, and the other. And then it's basically vanished because we've done that now. But of course, what we haven't, in fact, it's the opposite. So Anchiornis is a little, I've got one on my shelf just in case people are watching the video. This is a little model of Anchiornis. This was a name dinosaur actually helped name. Small feathered dinosaur from the Middle Jurassic of China, greyish with some black and white bits on the arms and legs and tail, and a red bit on the head. That colour and that pattern comes from a study of a well-preserved Anchiornis fossil, looking at these little colour packets called melanosomes that were preserved in the feathers and give us an indication of the colour. Brilliant. I've been to a museum in eastern China that had the thick end of 1,000 specimens of Anchiornis. Not all of them with feathers, not all of them well preserved, but dozens that were. We've done one. That's not the colour of Anchiornis. That's not even the colour of that Anchiornis. That's the colour of that Anchiornis when
Right.
it died. Because males and females, different colours. Adults and juveniles, different colours. Males in breeding season can change colours. Males and females can go white in winter if you're a ptarmigan or a grouse or something like that. Animals that live in the north, often brighter than ones down south. Things like, the red-winged blackbirds? Some of them have a yellow stripe and some of them don't, or they have more blue in the north and less blue in the south. Then on top of that, we have albinos that are white, leucistic animals that have patches of white. We have melanistic animals that have extra black and extra grey. Those are all quite rare, but they all exist. So what colour was Anchiornis? I don't know. I have no idea if this animal was typical or abnormal. I don't know if it's a typical male or typical female. I don't know if it changed over the seasons. I don't know if it evolved over time. I don't know if it varied with geographical location. I don't know. And we know how to do it, and there's hundreds of fossils. The first thing I do is go and get a grant and sample every single one of those. And of course, the reason they don't is because if the answer is that is normal, this is just like a house sparrow, and they sample 100 of them, and every single one of them is black and white and grey with a red head, no one cares. But as far as they don't. It's never going to be the cover of Nature. Animal that we already put on the cover of Nature is exactly the same colour as it was, we said 5 years ago, is not a story. But what if they're not? What if there's white and dark ones? And we know these animals lived in environments that were very cold in winter. We already know that these are shedding their feathers annually and replacing them in the way that modern birds do. So what if juveniles are camouflaged and adults aren't? What if this is a male in breeding plumage and the females have blue heads? Or what if the northern ones are more white and the southern ones are more grey? These are not only fascinating statements to make, but they then start to tell you about behaviour. Because if males and females are different colours, that usually indicates a certain type of breeding system than if they're the same colour. When animals are usually the same colour, they're usually signalling to each other and they mutually support raising babies. Penguins look identical, puffins look identical, swans look identical because they're both raising the chicks. But peacocks, males look mad because all they're doing is running around trying to mate with as many females as possible, and the females build the nest and lay the eggs and brood them and look after the babies. So I can tell you the breeding system of these animals if we sample enough of them. Now, that's an insight you're never going to get any other way. We know how to do it, we have the technique, and we have the fossils, but no one's doing it. That's what I think we need to be doing. We need to stop chasing moonshot ideas, or even the ones we have developed like colour, just abandon them as soon as we've done them, because now we've done a bird and a mammal and a reptile. We've done that study, so let's move on. That's the first bit. It feels to me almost like, we've built a rocket that can escape Earth's orbit. Oh, well, we can get into space now, so we've done space. And it's like, well, no, that's step one to doing everything else that you can do with this. And it feels like that a lot of the time. Again, this, biomechanics studies, and I'm not trying to be critical of my colleagues, because it's the system we're trapped in. But you do the biomechanical study of T-Rex, and then, as I say, we'll now do Triceratops, because now we can look at the interaction between the two. Yeah, but we've done that now. So we're doing something else. Now we want to know if T-Rex would do that, or we want to know if this model works in this way, or can we? It's like, yeah, but you've done the hard bit, and it's the bit that I think people think is boring and not exciting, is doing it lots of times on lots of different things, but actually that's really interesting and important.
Why do you think it's important? What do you say to the critic who says, why are we spending this money on dinosaur research when we could be spending it on cancer research? What is the number one reason to study dinosaurs?
Well, so I mean, mostly we're not is the very short answer. I mean, there's like I looked at it's a cancer institute in somewhere like Oxford or Cambridge, And I looked at the number of academics working there, and it was like more than the number of paleontologists in Europe in this one building of this one institute in one country. So, yes, lots of money is being spent on paleontology, but in the grand scheme of things, it really isn't. And if you take someone like me, you know, I'm employed by a university, but my salary comes from the fact that I teach loads of students like that. So it's not like I'm hoovering up government grants or I work in a museum or anything like that. There's multiple different answers to this. I think it's three fundamental ones, and this isn't just true of paleo. It's actually some of it's particularly true of paleo, but it's true of everything. When you ask, you know, well, why are we supporting lesbian theatre, or you know, whichever
insert X
whichever
here,
like is the topic of the day of whatever people have decided is the wrong thing that shouldn't be supported. First of all, like, humans are inquisitive things. You know, we like this stuff. You know, we do. You know, well, if we're not funding something unless it's cancer research or unless it's new technology or unless it makes money, we shouldn't do it. Well, then why have I got pictures on my wall? Why does anyone go to the cinema? Why does anyone appreciate art? Because we do. That's how humans are built. This is part of human culture. And some of that is natural curiosity for interesting things, whether that's the philosophy of why anything through to how do dinosaurs behave. They are all things. They're all part of our culture. And of course, you just have to look at the people coming into a museum to suggest whether that's, again, an art museum or a paleo museum, to see that actually this is something that humans as a culture value. So if we value it as a culture, there's nothing wrong in investing it. So that's the first answer. The second one is, it is, when it comes to paleo in particular, it is genuinely like a gateway science. I got an email years ago from someone off the back of one of my Guardian articles, like talking about this subject, and said, I got into science through dinosaurs. I was never interested in science as a kid. Parents got me into dinosaurs. Dinosaurs got me into science, and I started to see the value of learning and understanding things and working stuff out. I've just launched a satellite for the European Space Agency.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
Yeah. And it's like, okay, that's one guy, but he's the one who bothered to write to me. I'm sure there are plenty more out there, you know. And so it really is a thing. It is an educational tool. It is an inspiration. So it is valuable in that respect. And the third one actually is, you never know what the hell is going to turn out to be interesting and valuable and important. Even if you want to go down the route of, if it's not benefiting mankind in an obviously direct way, we shouldn't be doing it. Now, admittedly, this one didn't come off, but I've done a bunch of work on pterosaurs, as I said, the flying reptiles that lived alongside the dinosaurs. One of the things I've worked on quite a lot is their wing shape and wing structure and how they flew, because it's inherently interesting. But the big pterosaurs, 10-meter wingspan. These are very, very large animals indeed. Could weigh 200, even 300 kilos. So absolutely massive. They could fly. And actually on the ground, they could run too.
Wow.
So these are animals capable of running at speed as terrestrial animals and capable of taking off and flying. And with a very odd and unusual wing structure that's quite different to bats. So they have a membranous bat-like wing, but the actual structure and how it operates is very differently. So a good friend of mine, who I've done a lot of papers together with, he got invited to the Skunk Works, if you know what that is. So the Skunk Works is the legendary secret laboratory of Lockheed Martin. Because they were very, very interested in next-generation wingsuits for parachute troops and for building drones. Because at the moment, drones are all the flying drones fly. You know, they're little helicopter things with little helicopter blades, and they fly around. But if you get them into a building or something like that, they actually don't work very well. You know, they can't fly in an enclosed space. Right. What if we could build a drone that we know could walk and even run, but then jump and fly? Well, we know how to do that, kinda, because we know pterosaurs could do that. We know they could. We have all the data. And obviously it's easier to build to a known working model than it is to try and scratch build something. We know the size and shape and proportions of their wings. We know how thick the wing membrane is. We know how long their legs are. We know where the muscles sit. We know the overall weight. We know the balance point for where you want the center of mass over compared to the center of lift so that they have control during flight. We know all of this stuff. So we kind of know how to build it already. No one thought this when they described the first pterosaur wings 200 years ago, or a really famous paper in 2003, which looked at the individual structure of the fibers inside the wing that give it rigidity and allow it to warp and fly, and then some of the stuff we did on wing shape to show exactly how it extended and contracted. No one was thinking of next generation aircraft. And okay, you can argue about the morals of weaponizing science, yada, yada. But the fact remains, this research was done completely devoid of that idea. And in fact, I wrote a paper with my colleague Mike and another colleague of ours, Liz, talking about biomimetics and the use of pterosaurs as a model for aircraft, because a bunch of engineers have tried it before. The problem is they always look at some fossils and then try and build them and don't actually bother to speak to the people who've been studying them for decades. And if they did, they might do a better job. But the fact remains, that data we have generated is being used by engineers to try and change aircraft design. Well, yeah, so that's why, because, yeah, most of what I do is never going to have any of that kind of impact. But I don't know, and nor does anyone else, which bits of it might actually turn out to be really important. And even if they don't turn out to be important, maybe none of it will. Quite possible, given what I work on. But culturally and educationally, I've sold thousands of copies of books, both for kids and adults. I've designed museum exhibits. I've been involved in documentaries. Companies aren't making these because they're valueless. They're making them because people do value them. And at that level alone, I've put stuff into the economy far beyond what I've ever taken out of it in terms of book sales and advertising space and even media coverage. So all that stuff is actually
I love it. Look, I completely, I mean, the fact that I really wanted you on my podcast is proof that I wanted it, because, and proof that I believe in it, because inspiring people to just be so amazed and drawn towards all the marvels of the world as it is today and how it was 100 million years ago is just cool. It's just interesting, and it gets us excited. It gets us in our exploration mode. You know, there's so many, space is another one, right? I think gateway into science is a really great way of saying it. You know, like there's a lot of arguments about like what has the funding into space materialized into. Well, you could argue like how many scientists were galvanized into action by just the thought of learning something about space, that they went and revolutionized a completely different industry of science or technology. And there's countless examples of that. And I'm sure I'm pretty sure Dinosaurs was my first science book. And I'm sure you would have had a lot of issues with the scientific accuracy of the content of that book. But luckily, what I've remembered isn't the content; it's just the cool pictures, and it's the first step into getting into all of the amazingness of science. So I couldn't agree more that these things deserve funding purely for the sake that they inspire people to dare and to move beyond what we know and just to look after the really, really big questions. I think it's so cool. I think your work is invaluable.
Because that stuff alone is. Yeah, invaluable is an excellent word. But then there's the really obviously direct stuff, which again is not true of every paleontologist, but like, what's the, single biggest problem that we arguably have at the moment? It's climate change. What has caused every mass extinction previously known on this planet, and indeed many of the more minor but very serious extinctions? It's climate change, whether that's a volcanic eruptions or mass oxygenation or mass methane release or asteroid impact or whatever else it was, it's climate change. Right, so how's the planet likely to be affected by that? Oh, well, if only there was a field dedicated to working out how this thing operates. Yeah, we have. This is a huge chunk of paleontology. What goes extinct? What is vulnerable? What tends to survive? How do things change as a result of this, and when? So again, going back to that, give me $500 million and what would I do, or what would I save with it, or something like that. Because of the fossil record on our studies of it, we have a pretty good idea of what kind of species are more likely to be vulnerable and which kind of ecosystems are more likely to be vulnerable. So we know where to try and fix the problem, or at least where we need to direct our efforts. yes, you can study the living systems, but if it takes 100,000 years for it to collapse, well, we'd have to wait 100,000 years to work that out. We haven't. We've got data sets that already show it. We've already looked at it. So yeah, there is absolutely, not everything. Dinosaur behavior does not fit into that category, but there's absolutely researchers who do the same kind of stuff that I do. And again, an entire other armies. I'm training people like that who may one day go into those areas, and I'm teaching them those skills and all the rest of it. And indeed all the other areas of science that they go into, because I teach zoology, evolution, ecology, behavior, taxonomy, and all this other stuff. Don't actually teach very much paleo at all. So, all of that stuff is still there. So yeah, it's not a frivolous science, even though it's very easy to see. Though, of course, the irony of that is that these comments you tend to get are always based around, oh, well, I saw that was in the media. What waste of money? It's like, yeah, but you saw it because it was in the media. Why was it in the media? Because the journalists thought it'd be of interest to the general public. They didn't publish it because they didn't think anyone would read it. The irony is that, that shows you that it has power. Otherwise, they'd never have said anything about it in the first place.
Look, I couldn't agree more. You're preaching to the choir for me 100%, and I hope these things get more funding. My iPhone's about to run out of battery. If I had to switch camera twice. This has been such an enjoyable conversation. I'm so happy that we were able to have the talk. It's definitely a different conversation that I'm used to. Like, it's a neuroscience podcast, but I wanted to dive into the behavior, and I learned so much. I think all the listeners will learn so much as well. And I just want to thank you for your amazing work in scientific communication. You are really a great communicator, and I look forward to keep watching your stuff as it comes out.
Oh, thank you. That's incredibly kind. And thank you for having me on and put up with me moaning for 2 hours.
It was so much fun. I will absolutely do a part 2 of Dave moaning. It was a lot of fun. Thank you so much, Dave. Pleasure.
Thank you for having me. Cheers.
Thank you so much for watching that slightly different episode of the Giant Shoulder podcast by David Hone. I thought he was an amazing scientific communicator. If you haven't fully scratched your evolutionary itch yet, then I would highly recommend going to Paul Cizek next. He's amazing. And as always, thank you so much. Subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you next time.